Tēnā teiwi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai rā ki tēnei wahanga o Native Minds, he mea whakapāha atu nei, atu I te pokapū o Māori land, I konei I ōtaki I roto tonu o ngā tiraukawa. Hoena e tekana kia huri te whakaaro ki tērā o tātou kua hinga nei te rātonu nei kia Moana Jackson. Ka hungunu mā, rongo mai wahine mā, porau mā, e tikana me tangitahi tātou mō tēnei o koutou, kua ngaro ki te pō. Ko hore he tangata e ritana ki ai. Nō reira heire koe e moana. Nāu te tauira. Nāu I whakarere iho ai. Wau tini kupu hei hoa haere mō mātou. I nā te nui o te puna o tō māramatanga, tō mātauranga, hei unu tonu, hei ngongo tonu mō mātou kua mahu nei a koe. Nō reira rā kei te hoa, kei te tuakana, kei te matua, kei te mātanga, kei te reo whaimana, heire, whakangarau tura. Whai atu koe I tō au wahine I a Dame June. Nō reira haere kaurua, moi mai kaurua, oki mai koutou e te hunga mate. Nā kāsi te taha kia koutou. Kia tātou, te pito ora tēnā koutou, and welcome. And welcome to Native Minds. For the moment, we grieve the loss of Moana Jackson, but the kaupapa before us tonight is one that he felt passionate about. And so we welcome you one and all to hear what our manuhiri had to say this evening. Welcome to Māori land. It's the tradition of Native Minds to introduce our guests according to a particular pattern. But before we get there, I just want to say that for those of you who are watching, please feel free to send us your questions on the Q&A box in the whatever they call it, and we'll pick up the questions a little later on the show. But thank you for joining us, and I pass now to our guests for them to introduce themselves by answering three questions. Firstly, what is their tribe or nation? Secondly, what is their name? And thirdly, what they believe to be their personal kaupapa, their reason for being. So I'll start here on my immediate left.
Tēnā koe, he te tingane, o te rā tēnā koutou. He uri ahau no Kaitahu, ko Kim McBreen tōku ingoa. I guess my calling would be to talk about colonisation and all of the things that colonisation, all of the harms that it's brought to our people, but also to talk about all of the beauty of our mātauranga, of our tikanga.
Tēnā koe, Kim. Ka huri kia koe te tuakana.
Kia ora tānu, kia ora koutou. I whakapapa to Ngāti Parau mainly. We do have a kuia somewhere back there who from Ngāpuhi as well. I also have ancestry to Danish ancestry, Irish, English, German, so yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag in there. Yeah, sorry, my name's Aaron Smale. What's my kaupapa? One phrase I've used a lot quite recently is, I think my job is to give, in my storytelling as a journalist, which is my main occupation, is to give people the dignity of being heard. Mm-hmm. And particularly people who have not been heard and have been, in many cases, silenced. And yeah, that I think covers quite a bit of what I do and have been doing for a little while. And it's, we need to venture into some pretty interesting territory.
Tēnā kōrua. Our guests this evening have come to discuss a particular subject which has many dimensions, but the context, I suppose, is that the world is becoming more and more aware of what happened in Australia with regard to the stolen generations. what happened in Canada with regard to the residential school system, and the institutional care of children that resulted in abuse. And here in New Zealand, and again, just to reiterate the fact that Moana Jackson was one of the people in the beginning who helped get this current Royal Commission of Inquiry off the ground, looking to abuse in state care and state and faith-based institutions. This study is looking at the last half of what happened in the last half of the last century, and the report results will be released next year, in the middle of next year. We also have the annual report of Oranga Tamariki. Both these things are starting to reveal that much is very rotten in the state of, in the situation with regard to looking after our children, our vulnerable. This is a many-headed hydra. And for this evening, in this episode of Native Minds Considering Issues of Hauora, we're looking at adoption. We're looking at adoption and the disconnection that people who have been adopted can sometimes feel from their own natural roots. It's a situation that I know has affected many, many whānau throughout the country and my own. Adoption can be a loving experience and it can create relationships that will last for a lifetime, but it can also be difficult and it's always a challenge. And so it's in this perspective of the tiaki te tangata that we're going to start our kōrero this evening. And I'll ask our brother Aaron for his whakaaro. Kia ora, Ewa.
Kia ora tāna. Yeah, I mean, adoption is something that is part of my experience. I was adopted at birth. My birth mother was a teenager at the time she had me. She was Pākehā and my birth father was Māori. By the time I arrived, the relationship was pretty much over. I won't go into the detail of that, but my birth mother, at that time, there weren't a lot of choices. She maintains that she made a choice to adopt me and she did that for the best of reasons. But when you look at it more broadly, there weren't actually a lot of options to choose from. So in that era, I was born in 1971, which was actually the very peak of the adoptions in New Zealand. And for, I guess, at least, well, over one generation, the 1955 Adoption Act, when I was adopted, it was a closed, what was called closed adoption. So once the adoption order was finalized, that was that the birth mother had no contact and the child grew up not knowing who their birth parents were. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that that closed adoption system, that was never actually the law. It was policy. And that policy was driven more by social stigma than it was by any rational kind of argument. There were theories, the clean break theory, for example, that believed that if the child was transplanted from here to there, that they would grow up as if they were the parents, the child of the adoptive parents. So, but it was essentially a pretty brutal social experiment that was carried out on thousands of children. I mean, I think when 1971, there was around 5,000 children. So that was my entry into the world, if you like. And I grew up being vaguely aware that I was Māori. There was an A4 piece of paper that my adoptive parents were given, which just had details like occupation, eye colour, height, etc. And it mentioned that my birth father was Māori, and that was all I had. That became a little complicated when I met my maternal grandmother, firstly when I was 15, 16, and she looked at this bit of paper and said, no, sorry, that's not correct. So I went from being Māori to not being Māori, and then eventually I found out that yes, my birth father was Ngāti Porou. And so growing up, I knew nothing. And you only realize in hindsight how destabilizing that is when you actually find the people that you are like, how much you missed out on. And so that was my experience growing up. My adoptive parents did a great job. They were good parents. But what I've worked out is that through research and through conversations is that one aspect of that whole system was that it was a supply demand. And when there was an oversupply, those who were adopting could be selective, if you like, and stipulate a wish list. And at the bottom of that wish list were Māori boys. And so when I found this out, I was quite devastated actually, and quite angry as to, well, what was wrong with us? And that became, I guess, a bit of a springboard for me, that question, which led me on to the work that I've done with state abuse.
Just to carry on before we turn to Kim, Aaron, what was there about your journey to connect that led you into your vocation looking for the circumstances behind state abuse?
It was a bit of a long winding road, if you like, but there was, I think it was that point where, well, I'll fast forward, but actually I met and found out I had a sister I didn't know existed when I was about 38, and that kind of turned my life a bit upside down, and trying to find her to begin with. And then when meeting her, just finding this person that I had this immediate rapport with and was very much like, it was like meeting your twin, because we could just about finish each other's sentences. And that was quite a strange but amazing experience, to find somebody that you clicked with, because I just never had that. I did connect with my birth parents and could see obviously that, you know, I inherited a lot from them. But to have a person who had not only that was like me, but had been through the same experience was quite significant. And that's where this question arose. And that's where I did, again, as a journalist, I looked back and thought, well, how did this happen? And that led on to a whole lot of other questions. And I was already a journalist. I had quite a bit of experience at that stage. But I'd also done previous stories around incarceration. Why were there so many Māori in prison? And one of the things that kept popping up in that conversation was welfare homes. People that I knew and would refer to this as one of the contributing factors to people ending up in jail. And so I didn't really click to the significance of that at first. And it wasn't until a book came out by Elizabeth Stanley that mapped out some of the experiences of people who've been through those welfare homes, but it showed the numbers, the sheer numbers. And that's when there was just some sort of light went off on my head. It's like, okay. Because there had been, for me, this kind of gap in the history as to, okay, here we were as a rural people, okay, poor, but functioning quite well in many respects. And then, you know, then you've got the once were warriors version of, and the common explanation for that, you know, change was urbanization. And I was never really convinced, and I'm still not convinced that that was the problem, because it wasn't Māori that had trouble adapting to urbanization. It was actually Pākehā had problem with adapting to so many Māori suddenly living in close proximity to them. And the state was very nervous about that as well. And you can see it through the files and the archives, that they were trying to manage this sudden influx of Māori, but what they were trying to manage was actually Pākehā response to that. And so the welfare system and the police and everything seemed to just bear down on these new, you could say migrants, because Māori Affairs were treating them as migrants, not tangata whenua. And how do you manage this foreign population just arriving in cities en masse? And for one example, there were what were called J teams, which were police and welfare would team up and go into communities like Māngere, for example, and basically target kids that were playing on the street. And that's how a lot of these kids would end up in the system. Sure, there were incidents where there were whānau where there was, you know, abuse or neglect going on. But I'd say the vast majority of the individuals that I know, it was for trivial things. It was for poverty. It was for wagging school. It was, and so there was this big influx of, if you look at the Māori kids born between, say, the late 1930s and the sort of early 1960s, it's that cohort that suddenly are growing up in the cities and are getting targeted by police and welfare. Before World War II, there were virtually no Māori in these welfare homes. And so what changed? The change was that suddenly Māori were living next to Pākehā, I think.
That's powerful stuff, Aaron. Okay, Kim, that's part of Aaron's story. Part of your mahi is looking at some of the causes of this. So can you share what you have to offer at the moment, please, Aaron?
Yeah, kia ora, Aaron. I thought about what I wanted to talk about tonight, and waking up this morning and hearing of Moana's passing, I sort of, I've rethought what I wanted to talk about, because I want to talk about what I've learned from him, which I think ties in with a lot of what you've been saying. I think, what Moana's most well known for, if you don't know him, the thing that he will be a legend for is his critiques of colonisation, how damaging colonising thinking and actions are. And he helped me, and I don't know how many other people, understand that more clearly. And I know that I will forever be grateful for that. Whenever I'm trying to find the words to talk about some particular aspect of colonisation, probably strangely, I find his words encouraging when he talked about how colonisation is inherently abusive. Moana could see that arrogant, casual cruelty of colonisation, and he would name it, and that's that's great. But what I loved most about Moana wasn't those insightful critiques of colonisation, of colonisers being colonisers. It was his unwavering faith and love of his tūpuna, of his whānau, and aroha atu kia koutou. And in us, not just Māori, but anyone who is working for a better future. The faith that he had in whānau Māori, in mātauranga Māori, in tikanga Māori was a really beautiful thing, and it's really inspiring. Moana was so driven by love, and if you were fortunate enough to spend time with him, which I know so many of us got to, because he was so generous with his time, you couldn't help but feel that love. So what does that have to do with adoption? So for the last 4.5 years, I've been part of a 3-year project with Moana and a team of about 10 of us, looking at whāngai and the adoption of Māori. And we interviewed about 100 people about their experiences of adoption in whāngai. And one of the things that came through is how strongly the state came at whānau, which is kind of what you've been talking about, the tikanga of whānau, and what that's meant for us as adoptees. Because it's not just that we were taken from whānau with no easy road back, it's that colonisation has kept attacking whānau, and all of our whānau are affected. So lots of adoptees talk about really, really wanting whānau. And some do get to find that. Probably most of us don't get anything like that. We track down our files, we find our parents, we try to connect with whānau, we're looking for a kāinga. And what some of us find is an empty field with a house that burnt down 50 years ago. And I know that that's a really tragic image, but that's actually what happened in my whānau. That whare was the whare that my grandparents grew up in. And when it burnt down 50 odd years ago, my grandparents' generation were fighting amongst themselves about what should happen, and so nothing happened, and now there's this empty section with a mound where the house was. Yeah, so for some whānau, the tikanga that held them together have been smashed hard enough and long enough that they drift apart, and I think that's a fair description of where my whānau is at. Lots of whānau are doing better, but some are distracted by all the urgent challenges that the state keeps throwing at us. They want to welcome the adoptees back, but they're too busy putting out fires. And then there's probably some whānau that don't want to welcome us back. They're busy getting on with their lives. They don't want to deal with this person who says that they're a love child of someone. And some adoptees don't even get to find their whānau. And what does that mean? What does it mean if you can't know your whakapapa with everything that people say about whakapapa and what it means to be Māori? Yeah, so many adoptees feel really rejected and angry, whether it's people like me who went to find their whānau and discovered that it's not really a whānau anymore, or it's people whose whānau were too busy doing other things, or whānau who felt like they didn't necessarily want these other people back, or they weren't able to find their whānau. Often people feel really rejected and angry about that, and that's totally understandable. And it's really hard to direct that anger at the actual cause of the problem, which is colonisation and colonisers, because that's really abstract, and it's much more satisfying to be angry at the people that are actually hurting us and rejecting us, which is, our whānau. Yeah. So I wanted to talk about how we need to do better, and to do that, we need to understand adoption as a problem. And when I'm talking about adoption, I'm not just talking about close stranger adoption. I think that adoption is a problem. I see adoption as a system that turns children into charity. People talk about these poor babies who need someone to take them in and love them. And thank God for the generous, caring, selfless Christians who are willing to do that work. And I know that sounds really unfair and ungrateful and quite harsh, but I want people to think about what's upsetting about that statement, because it might not be the official version of adoption, but lots of us have heard that story. When you're adopted, you hear lots of people's opinions about adoption. And I've heard a lot of people talk about adoption pretty much exactly that way. I've recently, I looked up online to see what the stories are of how people write about adoption. And there's some magazine articles and newspaper articles that are probably even more patronising than what I've said. So I think it's really clear that adoptions come from this idea of charity. When you look at its whakapapa, you see it's come from workhouses and orphanages. And yeah, all of these solutions to this problem come from this idea of children as charity, and the people who are willing to take on these children as their saviours. And that's a really dangerous thing for children. It spawned a whole heap of dangerous practices, from orphanages to charitable schools. Dilworth was a charitable school, to the things that you found in Lake Alice, or the welfare homes that you're talking about. If the state cared about children, they'd check on us. But they never do. They never really checked on us. They're consistently more concerned about the reputations of adults rather than the safety of children. And that tells us something. And I think we're not really used to adoption being brought into this conversation about how children have been abused in care. You know, can we really compare it to what happened at Lake Alice? And it's true that lots of children had really lovely experiences of family from adoption. It's also true that pretty much all adoptees feel like we have to tell a nice story of our adoption. We have to be really careful to say how great it was. And I think it's really important that people understand that adoption doesn't have to be horrific to not be a good practice, to be a dangerous practice. But sometimes it was horrific. And predictably, because it's an ignorant and poorly designed system. And you called it an experiment. I don't think we can call it an experiment because no one cared enough to check on the results. Like it's shocking to me that it doesn't matter what sort of state care you're talking about. Nobody cared to check on us. And the problem is that people only know the official story of adoption, which is a PR story. You know, we only hear the side of the social workers and the politicians and the adoptive parents, which is the saviour's side of the story. And we don't really get to hear too many adoptees' stories until recently. But even now, I can probably name all of the people who are telling their stories of adoption. And at the same time that the state was promoting this system that I see as abusive, that I think is abusive, there was a much better model. There were a few better models that they were aware of and completely ignored. Whānau. If the state cared about children, probably the easiest thing it could do is stop attacking whānau. But they don't. Yeah, it could even, God forbid, support whānau. Yeah, I mean, one of the beautiful things about whānau that the state totally should have learned from is that it adds relationships to children's lives, to people's lives. You know, it brings people together and it puts extra eyes on everyone. It creates safety. It creates community. You know, that's a really safe system. But I'd say that the state cares more about bringing everything under its control. You know, you talked about containment rather than the safety of children. Yeah, so much for not talking about colonisation. What I want to say to finish, there's a couple of points I want to finish with. The first is that we all need to be aware of disconnection. We need to talk about disconnection. We all need to make space and listen to stories of disconnection, disenfranchisement. Because for adoptees and our children and all of the people that struggle to work out where they fit in, you'd be surprised how often we're in situations that feel like we're completely excluded or at least really uncomfortable. And, you know, something as simple as mihi that kids are expected to do in school can be really alienating for some kids. And the answer isn't to not do it. The answer is to talk about colonisation and disenfranchisement and whakapapa. And the second thing I wanted to end with is the way that Moana talked about whakapapa, which I take a lot from. He described whakapapa as a series of never-ending beginnings. I think that gives us a lot of direction on how we should think about whakapapa and put into practice. And finally, I just want to acknowledge Aaron's work on state custody of children. I'm so grateful for that work that you've been doing.
Thank you.
I want to bring adoption into that. It's part of that long and ongoing story of the state creating systems where children are harmed and refusing to admit that. And the answer isn't improving those systems. I hope that people won't keep putting time into helping the state to improve those systems because they don't get better. and that mahi just gives them legitimacy and a few more years of some, you know, the next iteration of hurting children. And I don't think the answer is partnerships between the state on one hand that makes all the decisions and rōpū or NGOs or iwi who are doing the service work, because all that does is set up a system where the state is still controlling a system where children are hurt, but our people are getting the blame for it. What we need to do is recognise that the state is just too messed up to be around kids, and to really commit to doing that work ourselves, the really important work of, you know, identifying when kids are in unsafe situations and what we can do about it to keep the state out of it.
Tēnā pēwā. Aaron, Kim talked about the state being messed up. I mean, one of the things that's very, very apparent, I mean, you know, talking about not having information, I mean, these reports from Oranga Tamariki and the lack of data, the lack of reporting, how can this still be carrying on today?
How long have we got left? Yeah, I'll track backwards from that question, because at the moment, for example, you know, Oranga Tamariki, for example, has had a lot of flack. My colleague, Melanie Reid, obviously did the story on Hawke's Bay that showed the brutality of the state and some pretty graphic footage. Now, at the moment, there's some legislation going through the House. It's at the bill stage. It's gone through one select committee, and it's about the oversight of Oranga Tamariki. I won't go into the detail, but basically, I looked at it and despaired. And I'm not the only one. There is a number of people who've looked at this, and one lawyer I know who's an expert in this area said it should be binned. It's just that bad. And my take on it is that they're effectively dismantling what little oversight there is there, and creating this fragmented thing that's going to, when I looked at it, the reason I despaired is because, you know, we've had 50 plus years of this. What happened in Hawke's Bay is not new. And so here we have a Royal Commission, we've got all of these inquiries, and we've got hopefully changes being made. And yet what I saw in this legislation is this opens the gate to 50 years of further harm. So how did all that happen, and what is wrong? You know, the state's messed up. Well, it's actually, it is messed up, but it's also very, the state is a legal person, and it behaves in a way that is about, essentially, there's a number of things, but its first instinct is to protect itself. Secondly, it never wants to relinquish control. There's a number of other points I could touch on, but Moana was very good at, you know, you can see something like that Hawke's Bay incident, and it causes this great uproar in the media. But what Moana was so good at was actually breaking it down and showing, how did we get here? You know, he was very good at breaking down the whakapapa of what colonisation was and how it operates. And one of his heroes, he told me once, was the guy Raphael Lemkin, who was he's a Polish Jew who had survived the Holocaust, or dodged the Holocaust, if you like. And he was the guy that came up with the definition of genocide. And one of the elements that he included, one of the points that he included in that definition was the removal of children. People think of genocide as only like slaughter, you know, going in there with a machete or a gun and shooting and killing people. That's obviously one aspect of it, but it has all these other layers, and it's about, you know, displacing people is a form of genocide. Taking their children is another. And if you look at colonisation, and again, I'm leaning on Matua Moana here, you know, if you look back at what it was trying to do, it was essentially trying to dismantle. If you can't kill a group of people, well, then you erase them. And how do you do that? Well, if you look at what colonisation has done, in particularly Anglo countries, one is firstly, it's after the land. Secondly, and it doesn't necessarily roll out in chronological order, it's happening all at once, but taking the culture, taking the language. Many of us have whānau, grandparents, parents who went through native schools and were punished for speaking the reo. And that's about trying to erase this difference. And if you look at the land legislation, for example, and I'm getting to the point around adoption, a lot of the issues around adoption used to be handled by the Māori Land Court. And the reason for that was succession. It was about succession of resources. And if you look at the 1955 Act, it basically, and whānau were included in that. And so, but what happened in the 1955 Act is that it's there in black and white. Traditional Māori adoptions will no longer be recognised. So this is what I was talking about before, about these options were taken off the table. Okay, my father wasn't there to do, you know, whatever he should have done, but in Māori whānau, so what? Somebody else would have stepped in if they had been given the chance. And I know for a fact that there are members of my whānau that would have, if they had have known. And so that option, again, it's about dismantling a group of people in terms of their identity, their resources, and even their children. And if you look at the residential schools, it was there's a phrase used by one of the original guys, I think his last name was Pratt. He set up Carlisle School. It was kill the Indian, save the child. And it was about this civilization that you had to assimilate them to basically erase them, because if they were still around, if you hadn't killed them off, then you basically undercut any claim they have to land or resources or to any sort of separate political identity. And so adoption's just one part of that. But it's when you branch it out and look at where it sits within that whole outlook and attitude towards Indigenous people, it's not an accident that this has happened in other countries.
Kill the Indian, save the child. It's a terribly correct pungent.
Well, it's interesting because in the latest report, the redress report that came out of the Royal Commission, they quoted Moana, and he referred to genocide. And I thought that was a little bit of the Commission gingerly stepping towards that term. Moana Jackson said it, well, it must be okay because he knows what he's talking about. But I think whether they will go there and really unpack that, I don't know. But it's certainly, if you look at the damage that has been done to, you know, the people that I've engaged with and that have gone through the state abuse system, you know, that was like a fork in the road for their lives, and where they ended up, whether it was gangs or prisons. Those guys would have been, and men and women, many of them would have been leaders and you know, highly intelligent, smart, and they would have been leaders and entrepreneurs wherever they ended up. Unfortunately, they ended up, you know, leading the sort of the gangs that we hear so much about.
It's tragic, but it's also destructive of human potential.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, Nadiwi, I'm here with our guests, Aaron and Kim, and we're talking about adoption. Please feel free to send us your questions on the Q&A thing on the doohickey. But for the moment, we do have a question from anonymous someone. Oh yes, attendee. So I'll just read this out. Currently in residential specialist school roles in Aotearoa, almost 50% of the roll across 3 schools are Māori and mostly boys. The Ministry of Education are currently looking to loosen up criteria to enable those schools to increase their roles. What do you say to the policymakers who continue to colonise and institutionalise our rangatahi? Well, more of the same in a different vein.
Again, how much time have we got? I don't think, this doesn't answer the question, but I don't think the Royal Commission was given this scope up to 1999, and nobody's ever been able to explain why that date was put there, because there's no, there was no legal change in the legislation or anything really. And it's almost, I think, to protect sort of more recent governments but nothing has changed.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm living within, I mean, Tere, Auckland Beach School, they were two of the worst places. They've closed, but there's a number of other institutions, other forms that have popped up. It's all very well to close down the bricks and mortar institutions, but the attitudes haven't actually shifted.
Because as you said, this is about policy more than it is legislation. And as the question says, what do we say to the policy makers who continue to colonise and institutionalise our rangatahi? Presumably going to have an impact on policy, but...
Well, policy can swing all over the place.
Yes, exactly.
You know, legislation goes through the House, but policymakers can kind of just make it up and not really have any scrutiny put on them. I mean, adoption, for example, you know, as I say, there hasn't been any change in the legislation in what we're going on pushing 60 years now, and yet the policy has swung from one extreme to the other. And so, who decided that?
Is the policy sway just because of political interests, left and right, or is it just character?
Just
people in power.
Just the fashion of the day.
Well, as James Henner did, he once talked about the whole Māori language suppression as being less a legal thing than a gentleman's agreement.
Yes. Yes, and I think, if you look at the average career span of a politician, it's about 6 years. The average career span of a bureaucrat is probably over 20. So they have this immense power, and yet they aren't, there's no real, like this legislation that's going through at the moment. I mean, I've dug down into some of the cabinet papers and who's informing that. It's the bureaucrats. They are the ones pushing this particular line because it's their institution that will be under the spotlight if it's actually done properly.
Kim, you talked about the need for an alternative system, if you like, and whether that starts with, and we've talked about it before, mātua whāngai and so forth. What is the shape? We need to knock down the system, but what is the shape of what you believe could work?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think coming back to that question about policy, like personally, I don't think there's anything to be gained from speaking to the policymakers. I don't think that's how we're going to get to look after our children. I have faith in small local solutions. I have faith in people's relationships and really leaning on relationships, thinking of community as the relationships that we have, not as these big communities that have politicians looking after them or whatever. And I think where we can come together with the people that we care about and talk about kids and do that at a human level, I think that's where the solutions are going to be. And I think there'll be lots of different solutions. I don't think there's going to be one right way, because whenever there's one right way, it's wrong.
Aaron, Kim talks about the human solutions or the human dimension. Tragically, it's often as simple as that. That human touch is just missing out of so much in this messed up state system, whether it's justice, education, adoption, whatever. Yeah. How do you get the humanity back into it all?
I don't know if this is answering your question, but one of the things that sort of sprang to mind when Kim was just talking just there was I've done a lot of stories around poverty, and that's, you can go to all sorts of places around this country. I've even done stories in Gisborne and Hastings, talk to people in Ngarawahia, Whanganui, South Auckland, and you get, it doesn't take you long, and somebody will say, oh, you need to talk to so-and-so, because there's always somebody who's on the ground doing something that's got no real necessarily formal structure to it. They are just in there, manaakitanga, whatever you want to call it. A guy in Gisborne I spoke to, Tutangari, and, the trust that he was part of was down this end of the Kaiti shopping mall. You had MSD in the middle, and then you had our iwi office down the other end. Well, guess who whānau we're going to? This ex-mobster and his crew. And I don't know, there's, and And I think we can talk about corrections. You can talk about oranga tamariki, but I think at times it's kind of looking at it from the wrong end, because what's driving those, how do people end up there in the first place? And at the moment, housing, housing has only become a high profile issue in the last, say, 5-10 years, because it's starting to bite white middle class people. Well, it's been biting Māori for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And so the struggle that many people are having, that's, if you're looking at the Māori communities, that struggle is even more acute. And when people are in that space and struggling and just lurching from kind of week to week and day to day, well, of course, the things are going to unravel. And of course, things are going to go wrong. So you can fix oranga tamariki, you can fix corrections if you like. It's not going to stop people falling off the cliff.
Which leads perhaps to what you talked about there too, Kim. I mean, maybe given the shortness of our lifespans, that it's too hard to batter the system and to look for alternatives that are community-based and just carry on like this fellow in Gisborne, just doing what needs to be done. What are your thoughts on that? Just ignoring the system and carrying on until you get attacked.
Well, I'd like to see the system smashed as well. But I do think the most important thing, the solutions to our most urgent problems are the things that we can do. And it doesn't really matter what sort of problems you're talking about, whether you're talking about kids or you're talking about interpersonal violence. I think we have got to find our own solutions, like we always had. The state's not going to do it for us. The state's not going to support us to do it for ourselves. Yeah, and it's just finding these sorts of forum to talk about things and connect with people, and to treat our relationships as the real resources for safety that they are.
Can I just flag something here that I think is a number that keeps me up at night? The last census found that 24% of our children are Māori or have Māori whakapapa. Now, the reason I say that frightens me is because it encourages me too, because it's like, our population has always grown faster than the rest of the New Zealand population. But what's going to happen? What's the future for that cohort of children? Because what happened was the ones that were born in that big baby boom back in the sort of 50s and 60s. Those are the ones that got caught up in the urbanisation, got all of that. But now we've got this bigger proportion coming through. If you look at the kids that are born this year, they will be adults in 2040 when the 200th anniversary of the treaty comes around. What's that going to look like? Because it could be plausible that, say, 25 to 30% of New Zealand's population are Māori. And you've got political parties cranking up now trying to play that race card.
Yes.
Well, hang on. We need to all pause for a moment and think, what's the future look like for these kids born today that are Māori? That goes for all kids. We want the best for all kids, but particularly for Māori who are in those stats that don't look good. What does that look like? We can't ignore it anymore. We've been ignoring it as a country for far too long, and that stat tells me, and that stat's an undercount, by the way, because they ballsed it up the last census. And I also know that there's a number of whānau that are so terrified of anything to do with the state, whether it's a hospital or a tamariki, that they will give birth to their pepe in the front lounge. They haven't got birth certificates. They're completely off the grid. And that's the kind of, it's those kids. What's their future? And if we don't start addressing it, well, we're going to actually entrench some of the stuff that's already happening. And that's why it frightens me, because we just aren't having that conversation.
As a final institutional kind of whakaaro at the moment, Kim, you talked earlier on about apart from wanting to bust it down, in terms of policymakers, I'm just interested in motivation. because part of me thinks that, you know, these people are, they're good people, and they don't want to, you know, they want to do good. But I also know they're imperiled by the incompetencies and the blockages that come with big systems. And so, I mean, how, quite apart from, as I say, wanting to knock down the system, how do we somehow captivate and get potential out of well-motivated people, good motivations?
Resource communities. Yeah, get the resources out to the good people doing the good work. I think that's...
And test the motivations of the policymakers by making them do that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Get out of our way and resource us.
Kia ora. Just like to share some more thoughts, perhaps, guys, in terms of your own stories, like for people who are wanting to connect. What are some of the, I suppose, the hints or tips or clues that you may have, quite apart from, you know, the desire? Because, you know, you have to, because I remember in my own family, we've had to look at contacting people you don't know, getting the adoptive parents to feel good about it. What are some of the big things that people looking to connect can think about or should think about? I mean, from what you said earlier on, one of the things is, you know, be careful about expectations.
Yeah, and it's hard to, you just don't know what's going to be waiting for you when you open that door and walk through it, or you make that phone call. And, you know, I've had a pretty good run myself and the experience of making those connections. There's been difficulties, and but I've also got members of my family who've had dreadful experiences. But even if that's what happens, at least you know, it's, I sometimes say that it's better to know the ugly truth than a whole lot of pretty lies, because and then once you know the truth, you can then start to deal with it. It's when you get lied to repeatedly and you have to keep rewriting the script and trying to figure out what the truth is. That's when that's the damaging thing. I mean, I've been fortunate to have very positive experiences when I took my sister back and brought her back into the fold. That was a special thing. And I took her into my auntie's and she says, look what I found. And but it's also, you know, it was a bit of a roller coaster emotionally that weekend, and my cousins are quite emotionally, highly emotionally intelligent, and they could see the struggles. And one of my cousins said as we were leaving, she says, cuz, you know, you missed out on us, but we missed out on you too. And that broke me, because it was like, you know, it's told me that it's not just a one-way loss. We lost a lot in terms of connection, but they lost us as well in terms of being able to contribute to whānau and bringing everything that we've got.
How did you feel about having someone to call cuz, bro?
Well, there's a lot of them. And sometimes we have this regular family thing, we get together every year, and like my birth father was one of 11. And of course, they're all kind of prolific breeders as well. And so there's a lot, and it took me a while. Every year I've got to recalibrate, who are they again, you know? But yeah, it's been pretty special, you know, and they were completely welcoming, you know, and particularly for my sister, I know for her, it was the same. She suddenly found these people that she was like, and she's a musician, and there's a whole lot of other things about her life, and that just boom, she just slotted straight in. And that's, she was up on the stage, you know, and playing with all the cousins, and yeah, it was just, it's been special to watch that. Yeah.
Sure, bro. Kim, one of the things about finding your parents, and sometimes the stories aren't comfortable, or you can't connect personally or in any way perhaps with the parents, but you at least have a tribal connection. What are some of the things that can give hope, I guess, for people for whom family connections have broken down, but tribal connections have been awakened?
I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that question. Some of us, different iwi have taken different pathways about how they respond to adopted people or whāngai people coming back to them, or adopted people who were raised by their people, whether they acknowledge them or not. And I think, you know, depending on your iwi, you don't know what you're going to get. You know, some iwi have said, we only acknowledge blood relations. And some iwi say, we only acknowledge legal relations. And some iwi say, we'll acknowledge anyone if their whānau say they're whānau. And I wish that we had lots more discussions about what whakapapa is in regards to that. Is it a legal thing? Is it a blood thing? Do our whānau get to say whether or not we're whānau?
Yeah.
I think those are such important conversations that have been neglected.
I mean, I don't understand the whole thing in the US where tribes have to sort of be a registered member. I mean, I know that's sort of happening partially here, but it's there. It seems to be a really big deal. You have to be legally registered, and it's just like, well, what does that mean for people who are adopted and chucked over here? And I think, yeah, just to add to what Kim's saying, I think, and this goes both for adoptees and people who've been through state welfare homes. You know, if you talk to some like gang members, for example, and you mention iwi, it's like, fuck iwi, where were they when I was getting beaten up in Kohitere, you know? And I think there's, you know, I've seen the Royal Commission go to iwi leaders and engage with them, but it's like, well, why? They have not really, they've in many instances, and again, Moana is the exception here. In many respects, he has been on the ground in trying to, you know, pull this whole thing apart as to what's happened. But he's the rare exception, and there's wahine around the motu who have also been on that waka. But by and large, iwi leaders have been. Somebody said to me recently they'll turn up for a hui about fish at the drop of a hat. But what about the ones that have been left behind, the ones that have been chucked into the system and spat out the other side and ended up in jail? What have you done about them? They're yours. What, you know, and I think there was probably a bit of a, we had a lot of leadership remained rural. A lot of this stuff was going on in urban centres, and so there was that sort of disconnect there. But I still think that there's, it's, you know, incumbent on those iwi leaders to sort out what is their attitude towards those who have been through the system. Why aren't they backing them and fighting for them? Funnily enough, it's been, you know, and there's been a number of Pākehā women. Sonia Cooper, there's a lawyer, Judge Carolyn Henwood, Elizabeth Stanley. There's been Pākehā women who have actually fronted and stood up for state abuse victims. Where are the iwi leaders?
As a final question for you both, I think for any person discovering their true connections, their roots, there will be moments of anger or disappointment because of expectations or breakdowns. What have you done to control or cope with your own anger or letdown or disappointment? What are your mechanisms? Denial?
Well, I've got an outlet and I can kick the shit out of them on the front page. But yeah, I just think it's the outlet for me in terms of not my own stuff, but it's for state abuse victims has been to just keep telling those stories, you know. And I think the most recent major project I did was on Lake Alice. It was a podcast series, and you know, the guys that I know in that, just awful experiences and trauma that they've been through. And when they're telling you this stuff, you kind of just reacting in yourself, within yourself, and disgust and anger and all the rest of it. And you think, am I losing my shit here? Am I losing perspective? And then you put it all together and put it out in front of the public, and the public reacts the same way. And it's like, that's the reward really, is that the public knows and reacts the same way.
And for you, Kim, I mean, you've written beautifully. I mean, what helps you?
I think the most beautiful thing that has happened to me is, as part of this project that we've been doing on whāngai and the adoption of Māori, I've got to talk with other Māori who are adopted. And it was such a beautiful moment the first time we all came together. They'd already talked with each other about things. It was new to me. I'd never talked to another Māori person who was adopted about adoption. And far out, it was so affirming. And, you know, all the different ways that we feel like weirdos. And, you know, why do I think this way? Am I a freak? And you're hearing other people say almost exactly the same things. Oh my God, this is adoption. Yeah, that has made the world of difference to me.
Bueno, I ki nei ōku mātua te kāingara, mo tēnei me mo te whāngai te tangata. Ore koe whānau kōpū mai ia, engari whānau mai koe taku manua. And some of my old kaumātua used to talk about adoption in the light of the kōrero, which said that you weren't born of my belly, but you were born of my heart. And perhaps if all of us think like that, all of us can be family. I just want to thank our guests, Kim and Aaron, for all the work that you've done and for the stories that you've shared. Tēnā koutou me te whakamaumahara i a moana. Nō reira ka tira tewi, ka mutu ake I kone wā tātou kōrero mō tēnei pō, haere pai koutou I roto I te wā. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, atu I Māori land, kia ora tātou katoa.